A wealthy young black woman holding a first-class ticket in her hand found her rightful seat stolen by someone who believed skin color outweighed fairness. What happened next shook the entire flight, exposing the ugliness of racism at 35,000 feet. But here's the question. Who will you side with when injustice is right in front of you? Aisha Williams had never been one to flaunt her wealth. Born into the legacy of a black billionaire father who had fought his way up from poverty, she carried herself not with arrogance, but with quiet grace. She had grown up in a mansion of glass and steel overlooking the ocean, but she moved through life with a heart that still remembered the stories her father told, of hunger, of cold nights, of doors slammed in his face. That memory was stitched into her, like a silent vow that no matter how high she soared, she would never forget what prejudice could strip away. At 24, Aisha had already built a reputation beyond her father's shadow. She was finishing her law degree, passionately involved in charities for underprivileged youth, and constantly balancing the pressure of being labeled the billionaire's daughter. But what defined her wasn't the money. It was the fire in her eyes whenever injustice reared its head. To her, success was meaningless unless it opened doors for others. On that particular morning, she wasn't thinking about battles or legacies. She was thinking about something simple: a quiet flight, a stack of case notes in her bag, and the chance to finally rest after weeks of exhausting public appearances. Her father had insisted on first class. "You've earned the comfort," he said, but Aisha often wished she could blend into economy, unnoticed, invisible. She longed for normalcy in a world that stared too hard at her skin, her name, her wealth. Airports were strange places for her. She loved the hum of movement, the rhythm of lives intersecting, but she could never escape the subtle gazes. Some people recognized her immediately. The girl who appeared on magazine covers as the heir to a fortune. Others didn't know her name but saw something else, a black woman who, to their eyes, didn't belong in the lounges or the priority line. She noticed the double takes, the whispers, the way a smile directed at another passenger could harden when turned on her. Still, she endured it all with practiced calm. She had learned that dignity was its own armor. She carried her leather bag lightly, walked tall, and reminded herself that her worth was never up for debate. That morning, as she rolled her suitcase through the terminal, she noticed little things: the ticket agent's forced politeness, the businessman who cut in front of her at the security line, the woman who muttered something under her breath when Aisha stepped forward. These moments were not new. They were threads in the same old fabric. But Aisha had trained herself to rise above, to keep her eyes steady on the horizon. She didn't know yet that this flight would test all of it: her patience, her dignity, her silence. She didn't know yet that within hours she would be forced into a confrontation that would echo far beyond the cabin walls. For now, she simply boarded the plane. Aisha's life had always been a contradiction. Immense privilege wrapped inside. The skin of a woman whom society too often tried to dismiss. Her father, David Williams, had made his fortune in technology, building an empire that Forbes described as impossible to ignore. But Aisha knew the truth. Every dollar had been earned through scars. She had grown up listening to his stories of doors that had been slammed in his face when investors doubted a black man could lead innovation, of banks that denied him loans while granting them to men with less vision but lighter skin. From those stories, she inherited not just wealth, but a weight. David reminded her constantly, "Our success is not armor. It only makes the target on our backs bigger." And Aisha carried those words everywhere, understanding that money could open rooms, but prejudice could still shove her to the corner. Her childhood, though gilded, was marked by reminders of this truth. At private schools, she was often the only black girl in the classroom. Teachers praised her intelligence, yet spoke with surprise when she excelled. Other parents whispered assumptions: scholarship kid, charity case, lucky to be here, until they realized she was the daughter of one of the richest men in the city. And even then, respect didn't always follow. Sometimes it turned into resentment, as though her achievements could only be explained away by privilege rather than ability. By adulthood, she had mastered the art of silence. Not submission, but silence as strategy. She chose which battles to fight, when to raise her voice, and when to let dignity speak louder than anger. It was this balance that made her admired, but it also left her exhausted. The airport, in many ways, was a theater of this struggle. As she wheeled her suitcase down the polished corridors, she noticed every detail. The man in line at Starbucks who cut in front of her with a dismissive glance, the security agent who patted her down with more thoroughness than the passengers before her, the couple in the lounge who stared too long, their expressions tightening when she sat nearby. Each moment was small, but together they formed a rhythm she had known her whole life, and yet she kept her chin high. Her ticket glowed in her hand. First class, seat 2A. She had earned this, through her father's sacrifices, through her own relentless pursuit of education and excellence, through every drop of effort that had built their family name. She reminded herself of that truth as she approached the gate. When boarding was called, she walked with measured steps, her posture steady. She entered the jet bridge, inhaling the familiar mix of metal and recycled air, her suitcase wheels echoing on the floor. For a moment she felt a sense of calm. Soon she would be in the air, free from stares, free from the unspoken judgments of the terminal. But as she stepped into the first-class cabin, her calm cracked. There, in the seat marked clearly as hers, Seat A, sat a middle-aged white passenger, his arms sprawled, his briefcase shoved beneath the seat in front of him. He glanced up as she paused in the aisle, and his expression wasn't one of apology. It was a smirk, sharp and dismissive, as if daring her to speak. Her heart tightened. She knew that look. She had seen it in boardrooms, classrooms, and streets, her whole life. It wasn't just arrogance, it was possession. Aisha clutched her ticket a little tighter. The hum of boarding passengers filled the cabin, the flight attendants moved about with rehearsed smiles, and for one suspended moment, everything in her life, the legacy of her father, the battles she had endured, the armor of her silence, collided with the sharp sting of humiliation. This was not just about a seat. This was about who was allowed to belong, and though the engines outside rumbled with readiness, none of the passengers could have guessed the plane wasn't going anywhere. Not yet. Aisha stood frozen in the aisle, ticket in hand, the hum of passengers behind her fading into a dull roar. Seat 2A, hers by right, hers by purchase, was occupied. The man looked at her with a smirk carved from centuries of entitlement. His body language spoke volumes. "This space is mine, and you don't belong here." She cleared her throat softly, forcing calm into her voice. Years of practice had taught her that the first step was always dignity. She held up her ticket, angled so he could see the bold lettering. "Excuse me," she said, her tone polite but firm. "This is my seat." The man didn't move. His eyes flicked from the ticket to her face, then back again. Instead of apology, he offered a low chuckle, the kind that dripped with disbelief. "I think you're mistaken," he murmured, loud enough for the nearest passengers to hear. "You might want to check in the back." The words sliced through her composure. In the back. The phrase wasn't about rows or numbers. It was about place, about where he believed she belonged. Aisha felt the eyes of nearby passengers land on her like spotlights. Some shifted uncomfortably in their seats, others lowered their gaze to avoid involvement. The silence of the cabin pressed against her chest. She lifted her chin. "No," she said evenly. "This is my seat. Seat 2A. The man leaned back, folding his arms across his chest, settling into the cushion as if to prove permanence. "Well," he said lazily, "it looks like it's taken." Her heart pounded, but her expression stayed calm. She turned to the nearest flight attendant, a woman in a crisp uniform, her smile plastered thin. Relief flickered for a moment. Surely this would be resolved. Surely fairness would prevail. But the attendant's response came wrapped in hesitation. "Ma'am," she began, her tone light, almost dismissive, "we'll sort it out. Why don't you step aside for now and let other passengers through?" It was not what she expected. Not a demand for the man to vacate. Not acknowledgement of her rightful place. Just a gentle nudge to move along. Heat surged in Aisha's chest. She could feel humiliation tugging at her, begging her to shrink. But she stayed rooted, her ticket trembling slightly in her hand. "This is my seat," she repeated, her voice lower now, steady like steel. The attendant's smile tightened. "We'll handle it. Please, just let us get everyone seated first." Behind her, passengers shifted impatiently. Bags bumped against her legs. Someone sighed loudly, as though she were the inconvenience, not the man occupying what was hers. And in that moment, Aisha felt the crushing weight of invisibility, the reality that her wealth, her education, her lineage meant nothing in the face of prejudice. To them, she was still the one expected to move, to yield, to not cause a scene. The aisle narrowed around her, and the air grew heavy with unspoken tension. Aisha held her ground, ticket firm in her hand, her voice steady though the edges of her composure trembled. The white passenger remained slouched in her seat, his expression smug, a man who had decided that entitlement was more powerful than truth. The attendant's face was strained with the kind of politeness that wasn't meant to solve problems but to silence them. "Ma'am, please," she repeated, "let's not delay boarding." Delay? The word stung, as if she were the obstacle, not the man who sat boldly where he did not belong. Another attendant approached, a man this time, his expression carrying the same weariness. He glanced at the ticket, then at Aisha, and sighed. "We're full today," he muttered. "Why don't we just find you another seat so we can get going?" Another seat, another place, another way of saying, "Step aside. Don't matter. Don't belong." Aisha's throat burned. She thought of her father, of the stories he told of boardrooms where his ideas were stolen and his presence erased. She remembered. Being 12, when a teacher accused her of cheating on a math test because no one believed a black girl could score that high. She remembered walking into a gala at 16, dressed in silk, only to be mistaken for the hired help. Now, at 24, with a law degree nearly in her grasp and the weight of her father's empire behind her, she was still being asked to yield, passengers whispered, their voices slicing through the silence. Why doesn't she just sit somewhere else? People are waiting. Always someone making a fuss. The shame pressed hard, a familiar ache that spread through her chest. Yet beneath it, another feeling stirred, an anger that refused to be silenced. She looked again at the man in 2A. His smirk hadn't faded. If anything, it had deepened, as though the flight attendant's hesitation was proof of his victory. To him, this was not about comfort or convenience. It was about power, the power to deny her a place even when it was rightfully hers. "I will not move," Aisha said quietly, her voice trembling not with fear, but with fury contained. The attendants exchanged glances, unease flickering between them. One reached for the intercom, signaling for the captain. The murmurs in the cabin grew louder, restless, a current of discomfort spreading among passengers. Some avoided her gaze, others stared with thinly veiled irritation. Minutes stretched. Boarding stalled. The plane, once filled with the hum of anticipation, now throbbed with tension. Engines roared outside, ready for takeoff, but inside the cabin nothing moved forward, and Aisha realized something in that stillness. This wasn't just her battle. It was a mirror reflecting the ugliness people preferred to ignore. Every silent passenger, every hesitant attendant, every dismissive whisper was part of the same story. A refusal to see her humanity. She held her ground. She would not surrender her seat, her dignity, her right. The announcement came over the speakers, clipped and uneasy. "Ladies and gentlemen, please remain seated. We are experiencing a delay." The cabin rippled with groans and frustration, but Aisha did not flinch. She had become the center of the storm, the reason the plane could not leave the ground. And as the engines cooled, and as the whispers sharpened, she knew the confrontation had only begun. The humiliation was public now, undeniable, and it would demand a reckoning that no one on board could escape. The cabin had grown restless. Passengers shifted, grumbled, checked watches, muttered complaints under their breath. But Aisha stood rooted, her figure in the aisle a quiet storm no one could bypass. The captain emerged from the cockpit, his uniform crisp, his jaw set with the irritation of a man pulled from schedule. His eyes swept the cabin until they landed on her. "What seems to be the problem here?" he asked, his voice low but sharp enough to cut through the murmurs. The male attendant gestured quickly toward Aisha, then to the seated passenger in 2A. "Sir, we've got a seating dispute. We've asked her to let us handle it, but—" His voice trailed off, the unspoken accusation hanging in the air. Already the framing was clear. She was the obstacle. Aisha raised her ticket, her hand steady. "This is my seat," she said. "Seat 2A, purchased in my name." The captain glanced at the ticket, then at the man sprawled in her place. The passenger leaned back casually, crossing one leg over the other. "She's mistaken," he said with a lazy smile. "I've been here since boarding. I think she's confused about where she belongs." The words carried more weight than mere seating. They rippled through the cabin, subtle nods and smirks confirming what others were too afraid to say aloud. The captain's eyes hardened. "Sir, may I see your boarding pass?" The passenger hesitated, then reached into his jacket pocket, pulling out a crumpled slip. The captain studied it for a long moment, his brow furrowed. "This says 7C, not 2A. A hush fell over the cabin. Proof lay bare in the captain's hand. But instead of resolving the matter swiftly, he exhaled heavily, as though the real inconvenience was not the theft, but the dispute itself. "Sir," he said slowly, "perhaps there was confusion. It happens. Why don't we find a way to move forward without delay?" Aisha's stomach dropped. Even faced with evidence, hesitation lingered. Her truth required negotiation, while his lie invited sympathy. The man smirked again, unbothered. "I'm comfortable here," he said, his voice dripping with finality. "I've already settled in. Surely she can sit somewhere else." Something in Aisha cracked. A lifetime of practiced restraint, of swallowing humiliation to keep peace, of biting back words to protect dignity. It all coiled tight in her chest until silence was no longer possible. "No," she said, her voice rising above the cabin's restless air. "I will not move. I will not be erased. I have the right to this seat, and I will not yield it to prejudice." Her words struck the air like thunder. Passengers shifted, some shocked, others annoyed, a few quietly approving. The attendants stiffened, the captain's jaw tightened, and the man in 2A's smirk faltered for the first time. The captain spoke into his radio, clipped and tense. "We need ground security at the gate." Gasps rippled. The delay had just become a spectacle. Whispers hissed around her. "She's making it worse. Why doesn't she just sit down? Drama for no reason." But others, quieter, fewer, leaned forward, eyes wide, witnessing courage they hadn't expected. Within minutes, uniformed officers boarded, their presence commanding silence. One approached the captain, who handed him the boarding passes. The officer's eyes darted between Aisha and the man in 2A. "Sir," the officer said firmly, "this is not your seat. You'll need to move." The man scoffed, his arrogance unshaken. "You're really going to make a fuss over this? Look at her. Does she even belong here? This is first class." The words, loud and venomous, spilled into the cabin like poison. The silence that followed was deafening. It was no longer a seating dispute. It was naked prejudice, stripped of politeness. And in that silence, a voice broke through. Measured, calm, but carrying weight that silenced the cabin. "I believe you've said enough." Heads turned. From row 1, a man rose slowly. His suit was sharp, his posture commanding. His face was familiar to some, though recognition spread slowly like wildfire. He held himself with the quiet authority of someone used to courtrooms, to judgment, to truth. He was a federal judge, and he had heard everything. The cabin hushed as the man in row 1 stepped forward, his presence commanding in a way no uniform could match. The federal judge, known to those who recognized his face from news features and high-profile cases, adjusted his glasses and fixed the passenger in 2A with a gaze that carried the weight of authority. "You've made it abundantly clear," the judge said evenly, "that this isn't about a seat. This is about prejudice, and I will not stand by while the dignity of a paying passenger is trampled in full view of the law." The cabin rippled with whispers. The word law seemed to change the air itself, heavy with consequence. The attendants stiffened, their painted, smiles faltering, realizing suddenly that this was no longer a dispute they could brush aside. The passenger in 2A scoffed, his bravado cracking but not yet broken. "This is ridiculous," he muttered. "I'm not moving just because some entitled girl wants to cause a scene." The judge's voice sharpened. "You are in violation of federal regulations by refusing to vacate a seat not assigned to you. And more than that, your words, dripping with bias, are an insult not only to this woman, but to every principle of equality this country claims to uphold." The officers stepped closer, their hands hovering near restraint, their posture unmistakable. "Sir," one said firmly, "you need to come with us." The man's smirk faltered completely. Panic flickered in his eyes as the reality of consequence dawned. Still, he sputtered weak protests. "This is nonsense. She doesn't belong here." But they rang hollow in the face of authority. His arrogance, once so loud, shriveled under the weight of exposure. As he was pulled from the seat, murmurs filled the cabin. Some passengers looked away, ashamed of their silence. Others nodded quietly, relief mingling with guilt. A few dared to meet Aisha's gaze, their eyes saying what their voices never had. "You were right to stand your ground." The seat was finally empty, but the stain of humiliation lingered. Aisha lowered herself into 2A with composure that belied the storm inside her. Her ticket, crumpled slightly at the edges from her grip, rested in her lap like a flag planted in contested soil. The judge met her eyes and inclined his head, a gesture of respect. "You showed remarkable courage," he said softly, before turning back to his seat. The cabin, though quieter now, hummed with a tension that could not be erased. The flight attendants moved about briskly, but their forced efficiency could not hide their shame. The captain muttered something about delays being resolved, but his authority no longer felt untouchable. And as the engines rumbled once more, preparing the plane for takeoff, Aisha understood something with searing clarity. This had never been just about a seat. It had been about her right to exist without apology, to claim space without being questioned, to refuse erasure in a world too comfortable with silence. The flight would continue, yes. But the echoes of what had unfolded in that cabin would linger far longer than the journey itself. The engines roared back to life, but the atmosphere in the cabin was far from ordinary. Conversations were hushed, fragmented, uneasy. Some passengers pretended to read, their eyes flicking toward Aisha in stolen glances. Others avoided looking at her entirely, as though ignoring her would erase the discomfort of what they had witnessed. Aisha sat upright in 2A, her posture composed, her expression unreadable. Inside, her chest still pulsed with the aftershocks of adrenaline, but she kept her face calm. Dignity, her father had taught her, was both shield and sword. Today, it had been both weapon and wound. The man who had tried to erase her had been removed, his absence a silence louder than words, yet his venom lingered. The insult had not been erased with his departure. It had been carved into the memory of everyone present. As the flight attendants resumed their duties, their movements were brisk, almost frantic, as though efficiency could plaster over their earlier hesitation. But the weight in their eyes betrayed them. They knew they had failed. Not just her, but the duty of fairness they were meant to uphold. For Aisha, it was not victory she felt. It was exhaustion. The kind that seeps deep into the bones after years of battling the same enemy dressed in different uniforms. Prejudice in classrooms, prejudice in boardrooms, prejudice now at 35,000 feet in the air. Always testing her patience, always daring her to surrender her place. She rested her hands lightly on the armrest, her ticket still folded in her lap. It felt less like paper now and more like a symbol, proof that dignity must be fought for even when it should have been unquestioned. The judge, seated just ahead, turned once to glance at her, his expression softening with something like admiration. He had spoken when others stayed silent. And though his words had tipped the balance, Aisha knew the confrontation had demanded more than authority. It had demanded her refusal to yield. The rest of the flight passed in uneasy quiet. But the silence was not empty. It was heavy, filled. With reflection passengers did not voice. Each person carried their own version of what they had seen, some with shame, some with relief that the matter was over, and a rare few with respect for the young woman who had stood when it was easier to bow. When the plane touched down, Aisha disembarked with the same calm composure she had carried onto it. But something within her had shifted. This was not the first time she had faced prejudice, and she knew it would not be the last. Yet today had stripped bare a truth she could no longer ignore. Silence does not protect dignity. Courage does. She walked through the terminal, her steps measured, her head high as though the weight of generations walked with her. Around her, passengers dispersed, each returning to their separate lives. But they carried the memory of what had unfolded in that cabin, a story that would be retold in whispers and conversations, a mirror held up to society's face. For Aisha, it was more than a memory. It was a reminder that wealth cannot shield against hate, that education cannot erase ignorance, that grace alone cannot dismantle prejudice. But it was also proof that dignity, when defended, has power, the power to expose injustice, to disrupt silence, to demand recognition. And as she stepped into the daylight outside the airport, the sun sharp against her skin, she felt a quiet strength settle within her. The world would not always offer her space, but she would claim it anyway, because love was stronger than hate, dignity louder than silence, and courage, the simple act of refusing to yield, was the flame that could burn through even the coldest. Prejudice. She paused, breathing in the air, and thought of the passengers who had witnessed it all. Some would forget, some would dismiss, but a few, perhaps enough, would carry it with them as a question that gnawed at their conscience. When injustice unfolds before your eyes, will you stay silent, or will you stand?